It is more than obvious that the world of today faces challenges of a colossal scope, actually challenges that are unprecedented in our whole history as a species. Think of climate change, think of biodiversity loss, think of pandemics, think of migration, think of global terrorism, war, hybrid wars, think of the renewed geopolitical confrontation and system rivalry, indeed, between Western liberal democracies on one hand and their autocratic competitors everywhere else in the world. Massive challenges. Actually, many scholars, because of that, speak about the polycrisis. Some scholars say the polycrisis is the signature of our era. Now, public intellectuals argue, and that is really reason for fundamental concern, public intellectuals argue that human mentalities are not equipped with the qualities that we need to cope with such massive problems that go way beyond our own existence and our narrow in-groups. We lack those capacities for a reason. Our very long evolution as hunter-gatherers has kind of trapped us into a basically tribal psychology that incurs severe moral limitations on how we think and what we do. Limitations that, according to evolutionary psychologists, are difficult to ease or even overcome. One manifestation, probably the strongest one, of these moral limitations is a phenomenon that is called insider favoritism, outsider discrimination. This comes always to the fore, especially when we are in times of crisis, when people feel threatened, when they see danger and risk. Then the natural human tendency, sort of evolutionary hardwired in our gene code maybe, the natural tendency to favor cooperation with those ones who we consider alike by language, skin color, religion, nationality. Those we favor, with those people we hark in our elbows and we behave like solidary people. But those that look different, who feel different, who dress different, those people we discriminate, especially in times of crisis. This is a tendency that you can trigger in almost everyone, and quite easily. It has been done in group experiments in psychology many times. So this tendency is kind of in our gene code. Insider favoritism, outgroup discrimination. So, this is a narrative that paints a very gloomy picture of our future, because basically it's saying we are incapable to cope with those massive challenges that we are confronted with. So and there's a lot of doomsaying, especially among public intellectuals, that builds on this narrative. But it is very hard to see that the narrators of those storylines back up their story with hard evidence. And for this reason, I want to try a different approach and try to share with you some insights into real-world data. What are they telling us? Are they supporting this doomsaying, gloomy narrative that human beings cannot cope because of mentality, capacity limitations that go back all the way to the beginning of our evolution as a species? I invite you to have a look in a project in which I'm working since many, many years, and it's fun. because the insights we are gaining there are sometimes stunning, and oftentimes in a very positive and optimistic manner. It is the World Values Survey, WVS. It is the biggest social science project that exists on the globe. It's a global network of scientists, political scientists, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, economists, a global network of social scientists who go out to all kinds of different countries in the world. So we want to cover global diversity, for sure. And we go out and want to find out how people tick, mentally speaking, in terms of their deeply seated convictions, what they find utterly right or wrong. Belief systems, basically speaking. What is the moral compass of populations in different corners of the world? And we asked things like, what do people think about gender relations? Child-rearing habits. How do they trust their fellow citizens? Much or not so much? What about tolerance of diversity between different human beings of different religions, ethnicities, and so on? What about life satisfaction, happiness? Civic engagement is an important question. How much do people participate in their communities? On the ground, but also maybe in political parties, in political procedures like elections, referenda. What do people think about the relationship between the market and the welfare state, human rights, democratic principles, and so on and so forth? This is what we after. And what we want to see is two things, basically speaking. We want to map cultural differences in order to see how big are they? How different are cultures in the world? And can we place them on a map relative to each other? So that we can see, okay, Germany is culturally speaking maybe closer to France than it is to Argentina. Questions like this, mapping cultural differences. The second one is as important. We don't believe that cultures are static and frozen forever, like a gene code. Cultures face problems and challenges and opportunities, and they should change accordingly in functional adaptation. So we are interested in cultural change. So mapping differences is one thing, tracing change is another one. So how do cultures move over time? And they're getting closer to each other, for instance, because of migration or globalization, or are they moving further apart? Both possibilities exist, of course. When we look at all the questions we ask, it turns out that we can condense all the differences that we find in 2 dimensions, just 2, of cross-cultural variation, and we can create this map here, cartographing the moral compasses of societies. And what you see on the horizontal axis, from left to right, is what we call sacred to secular values. Populations, very much on the right, emphasize secular values. What does it mean? It means that religion has lost its importance in a society. Maybe a private affair, but politically speaking and in the public space, religion is no longer important, and religious authorities are no longer seen as divine. But more generally speaking, secular means a distanciation from other quasi-divine sources of authority. Not only the church or religion, it's also parents, or the nation, or the state. So we abbreviate it as God, Father, and the fatherland. So societies more to the right have lost the belief in those divine sources of authority. Societies to the left, many Muslim majority countries, you see it immediately, they still believe in those sources of authority and consider them as unquestionable. You can imagine that this makes a very important cultural differences between different populations when they are on the right side or on the left side of this dimension here. The vertical one is slightly different, but also related, but it's mostly on family, fertility, and sex norms. We call the polarity the one between patriarchal values and emancipative values. Societies further down place a strong emphasis on patriarchal values. Societies more up place a strong emphasis on emancipative values. What's the difference? Societies in this corner here, they experience a very strong normative pressure on the female population to marry. Also, strong pressure on females to marry as young as possible, often just after puberty, and these marriages are oftentimes pre-arranged. So female consent is not needed. And these societies emphasize very highly fertility. So women should give birth to as many children as possible. Of course, before marriage, there should be virgins, and after marriage, there should be available for sex to produce children. And these societies have also in common that there is a very strict, a rigid emphasis on heterosexuality. In some of these societies, we cannot even ask the question about how tolerant people think or how tolerable people think homosexuality is, because it's taboo. Many of our interviewers say, we cannot ask this question, we are kicked out of the house when we do the interview. Now, the opposite situation we find in the Netherlands, in Scandinavia, also in Germany, Northwestern Europe, countries with a Protestant tradition. Here we find that people, yes, gay rights, lesbian rights, LGBTQ+, these are the topics. Gender equality is very strongly emphasized, even not achieved yet in perfection, but it is emphasized. So, emancipative values. We can summarize or group the picture a bit more easy because you will have seen that countries group into certain clusters where they are similar and neighbors to each other, and others are different. And this is what we call culture zones. You see them in the picture here. And you see very clearly, the West is still different from all other places in the world in its emphasis on secular values and emancipative values. The West is pretty much a singularity in this. You also see the global polarization between most autocracies are found rather here, most democracies are found rather here. So this is also a cultural reflection of the renewed system rivalry between autocracy and democracy. You also get a sense what it means when migrants from here, Muslim majority countries, so Turkish people go to Germany, Algerians to France, Moroccans to Spain. When people from this corner of the world come into this corner of the world, what is happening is quite clear. Cultural clash, because migration brings together populations from the most distant cultural positions in the world. I'm not saying this is an unsolvable challenge, but it is important to recognize it at least as a challenge about which something should be done. Also from another point of view, namely because we call this here the democratic fitness diagonal. Why? Because our data clearly show the more countries are away from the lower left and closer to the upper right, so the closer countries moving away from here and go to here, the more fit, ripe, mature, whatever vocabulary you want to use, the more fit is the society to sustain and fill with life democratic institutions. Therefore, these cultural differences are very important, especially from a political science point of view, where we usually normatively support democracy over autocracy as the preferred system of governance. Now, talking about cultural change, is this a static picture? Are cultures frozen in their place that they once have taken? No. And this is really amazing. When I produced this graph for the first time, I was stunned. I had many expectations how it could go on. I could have assumed that the Islamic world is going in the opposite direction. In reintroduction of Sharia law in many countries, criminalization of homosexuality, even the death penalty in some countries. You could have expecting a very different picture. But what we see everywhere in the world, as one generation replaces the next, cultures move from the lower left to the upper right, so from patriarchal and sacred to more secular and more emancipatory values. For democracy, this is a good outlook, because the move is alongside the democratic fitness diagonal. Not good news for countries like China or Russia, in the long run at least. Now, let me talk to what is driving this process, and this is very important. Why do emancipative values rise almost everywhere in the world? It's one part of the story is economic development. As societies move from being agrarian economies towards becoming industrial economies, towards becoming knowledge economies, who export high-end products and services like AI, emancipative values are becoming stronger. So economic development helps for a progressive moral development. And here we can see another take on this. The real driving engine of this is a change, a demographic change in people's lifetime investment. Fertility rates are going down everywhere. Maybe not in Afghanistan under the Taliban, but almost everywhere. And schooling and education in parallel is going up almost everywhere. So it's like a twister picture. Fertility going down, schooling going up. What does it mean? It's a quantity to quality shift in reproductive investment. It means that people invest their time no longer in maximizing the number of children, but in maximizing their skill level. We call this cognitive mobilization, because this works on our most noble capacity, human intellect. It is mobilized through this process. Different places in the world are just at different stages in this process, but they are all in this same process. When emancipative values grow, morally speaking, this is a development to be qualified as a good one, because it's a process of mental expansion. People's radius of concern for problems is widening. People's solidarity circle is widening. And that means that the growth of emancipative values works against insider favoritism. It creates a greater sense of altruistic, universal altruism. And this should be a positive development as well. And you can see it here. The move from patriarchal to emancipative values makes people more universalistic in their orientation. So greater concern for the world, for the planet, environmental protection, human rights, development aid, and not only looking at your own country, your own family, your own in-group, or yourself. So it's a movement away from selfishness and group egoism. And therefore, this is positive. This is what we need to face our problems in the world. And now the real final point. And this should be upbeat. Well, it's a double-edged story. The left-hand graph shows you how Germans, this is now Germany using as an example. The same picture could be done for the UK, for Sweden, France, Netherlands, and so on. Pattern is the same. So Germans without a migration background have a very strong emphasis on emancipative values. You see this here in this column. Migrants coming to Germany have very low emphasis on emancipative values. And if we consider that those values are essential for the functioning of democratic institutions, this is a problem, because it means that when we want to keep our democratic institutions stable, we need to do efforts to get the migrants to endorse, internalize as well the emancipative values. That's important. And it works. We see in the middle columns those migrants that are no longer first-generation migrants, but just have one or two parents that are migrants, but they were born in Germany and were going through the German socialization process. And here we see they closed the gap very much And in the third generation, it's probably vanished. So acculturation works. And that leads me to my conclusion. That's the very final point. If we want to take advantage of this very essential insight, we need to do everything to invest into education, and especially into civic education, and tailor the civic education programs, especially to the migrant population, and put emancipative values center stage in those curricula that we are teaching. It is possible to teach and make people live emancipative values. I hope this was a little bit upbeat, rounding up of the session. Thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure to be here.